Colonial International Network and co-editor with Arzu Mirali and Professor Stephen Small of the University of California, Berkeley, of the book series Decolonizing the Mind. For now, please welcome Mr. Sandew Hira.
Thank you. This is our sixth book in the series called Decolonizing the Mind, which we started last year. So I would like to put this book in the context of decolonial theory. And one of the things of decolonial theory is that we are fundamentally rewriting world history. And I'll give a mirror to the approach of Hatem on the colonization project of Israel. By positioning the occupation of Palestine as a colonial project, he brings to the fore how our world today is the result of 500 years of colonialism. And in rewriting history, I will give you a small insight in how we rewrite the other part of the history of the Holocaust, which is Nazism, to show you how Nazism was a colonial project. Now, in order to explain how to see Nazism as a colonial project, I'll give you citations from Hitler. Now, the view in the West of Hitler is very much linked to the Holocaust. If you talk about Hitler, you're talking about the Holocaust. That is how world history has been framed. When we rewrite world history, our first link of Hitler is not with the Holocaust, but is with colonialism. And Hitler himself saw Nazism as a project of colonialism. He says, what India was for England, the territories of Russia will be for us. So Hitler said, look, we have to do in Eastern Europe what the British has done in India. And he explains how this colonial project would look like. He said, it should be possible for us to control this region to the east with 250,000 men plus a cadre of good administrators. Let's learn from the English, who with 250,000 men in all, including 50,000 soldiers, govern 400 million Indians. This space in Russia must always be dominated by Germans. The Russian space is our India. Like the English, we shall rule this empire with a handful of men. So Hitler's project was mirrored after British project. So while Winston Churchill argued Hitler is a monster of wickedness, insatiable in his lust for blood and plunder, not content with having all Europe under his heels or else terrorized into various forms of abject submission, he must now carry this world of butchery and desolation among the vast multitudes of Russia and of Asia. Hitler is Churchill is accusing Hitler of being a monster, but Hitler is looking up to Churchill as his example. Now, how would the Nazi colonization look like in Russia? He says, the German colonists ought to live on handsome, spacious farms, The German services will be lodged in marvelous buildings, the governor in palaces. Beneath the shelter of the administrative services, we shall gradually organize all that is indispensable to the maintenance of a certain standard of living. Around the city, to a depth of 30 to 40 kilometers, we shall have a belt of handsome villages connected by the best roads. What exists beyond that will be another world in which we mean to let the Russians live as they like. It is merely necessary that we should rule them. In the event of a revolution, we shall only have to drop a few bombs on their cities and the affair will be liquidated. So he paints this picture because he has studied India under British rule and says that's how the way we should do it. And he's not looking only on to India but also to the colonization of the United States, of the Americas, where he argued that what happened was in fact the Aryan people, white people he calls Aryan people, doing what we should do in Russia. Now, what this means is this. The Holocaust itself, the history of the Holocaust, need to be rewritten according to the facts, not to the ideas of victimhood, but of the facts. And one of the facts is that the decision to start the Holocaust was not made until the capture of Ukraine, which is in September 1941, when the prospect for victory looked bright and the millions of Jews living in Eastern Europe was a problem. So when Hitler came to power, he didn't have the idea of a Holocaust yet. The idea of the Holocaust didn't even was not even there at the start of World War I. And if you look at the figures of those who have perished in World War II, 25 million war victims of the total of 36 in Europe were Russians. Russians, Ukrainians, Eastern Europe were the largest portion of people suffered. The majority of the Jews who died in the Holocaust were not from Western Europe, they were from Eastern Europe. Why is this important in rewriting history? Is to understand that the narrative of the Holocaust was not a narrative based on facts. It was a narrative that created victimhood. And not just victimhood, but the prime victimhood. It was a benchmark for human suffering. The Holocaust became a benchmark for human suffering, and that is where the argument came to rationalize the other colonization project, which Hatem talked about. This is how these two colonization projects are linked. And what Hatem has done in his book is what we are trying to do in a book I'm writing now, in the theoretical framework of decolonizing the mind, is to look at how mechanisms are there in the colonization of the mind. In rewriting history, we are either colonizing or decolonizing our mind. And the mechanisms which we are trying to analyze, I think we have a list of 30 mechanisms or so. One of them is the creation of amnesia, forgetting the facts. The way the colonization of Palestine went with the brutal facts which he has outlined on how systematic, before the Holocaust, the genocide already took place by ethnic cleansing in the villages, the method they used, is not part of our collective memory. How the whole project of Zionism started before the Holocaust is not part of our collective memory. A part of our collective memory is that it was linked to the Holocaust. So rewriting the history is countering amnesia. And even if in the simplest things, like renaming the geography, he gives the example of the lake Tiberias, which became the Sea of Galilee. We know that the country where the indigenous people lived for centuries was not America. America is a European guy, after which America was named, while the people living there had other names. Naming was one of the mechanisms, because on the name, behind the name, there's a story. The name conveys a story. And if you have the Sea of Galilee, you link it to a story of the Jewish history. And renaming is one of these important things, like the statues and all other mechanisms of colonizing the mind. So I think Hatem's book is one of the best examples of how a theoretical framework is being developed, of how to look at history, how to rewrite the history, both in its factual way as in its theoretical way. And I think that that type of work should be done on all other struggles in the world. And when you do that, we come up with another conception in decolonizing the mind, and that is that colonization has created plantations over the world. And all these plantations, Africa, Asia, the so-called Middle East, the Americas, all these plantations had the same master, serving the same purposes. But when we are in that plantation, we think that our own plantation is the only one which suffered from colonialism. And that's why you will have the blacks taking Africa as the sole suffering, or the indigenous people, you know, looking only at the indigenous people, or the Asians only at Asians. But when we see that the plantations are linked, then we develop a narrative that could link all this. And that narrative is in the decolonial theoretical framework that goes beyond Africa or Asia, and see the similarities and the differences which are there, and then try to understand and interconnect it, just as I decolonized the history of Nazism to link it with the decolonial approach of Palestine. This type of work is important because sooner or later it will have to be translated into a canon of knowledge. Now we are doing it, let's say, at the level of academia with books like this. But that same knowledge has to be translated into strips, as you're doing in there. It has to be translated into the lectures and the cultures and in all kinds of events where the central concepts of decolonial thinking are integrated in the knowledge, so that in 20, 40 years, if you talk about the Holocaust, you talk about settler colonialism in Palestine, you talk about colonialism as a whole, you could have the concepts and the facts and figures ready to understand how modern world system has came into being. So that's why I think it's a very, very valuable product that Hatem has now created, which I hope we will be using for the coming centuries. Thank you, Hatem, for it.